Hello, people of Earth. Welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I am Anthony, your host, coming to you from the Gulf of Corinth. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, I hope you're keeping cool. After recording and posting this episode 120, I am going to go jump into the aforementioned Gulf. But first, to introduce the topic of this episode. The events that we know the best from all of antiquity are not battles or conventional politics, but the church councils of the 5th century especially. The first council of Ephesus in 431 is, in fact, I think, the first event in all of classical or ancient Mediterranean history that we can track over the course of over a month. We have extensive documentation, from letters written before, during, and after the councils to acts taken down, that is, notarial recordings of what was supposedly said, imperial decisions made by the councils, and so forth. This is a very rich and diverse and fascinating record of events. Most people think of them in terms of the creation of Christian doctrine. One function of these councils was to decide the creed, that is, the formulation of belief that Christians were expected to assent to. But they did many more things besides. For example, they formulated rules for the conduct of the church, the clergy. Collectively, this is known as canon law. But they also functioned as large HR committees for the church itself, sort of trying cases of bishops who were accused of various infractions and crimes, but also playing politics at the highest level of the church by deposing or appointing bishops and patriarchs, and then trying to get the imperial court to ratify those decisions and enforce them. And it is more this aspect that we will be talking about today. In other words, set your image of the councils as meetings of bishops that get together to discuss theology and sort of decide or ascertain what the nature of God is. And let's see them a little bit more as sort of very large HR committees whose purpose was to investigate accusations brought against one or another of the membership of the episcopal class. And specifically, we're going to be talking about a bishop of Alexandria from the mid-5th century. This is Dioskouros of Alexandria. In the Orthodox and Catholic traditions, that is, Greek Orthodox and Latin Catholic, Dioscorus was turned into a kind of supervillain of church history fairly early on. And the acts of the Council of Chalcedon that we have, so Chalcedon was held in 451, Chalcedon is just across the Bosporus from Constantinople, were meant to make the case that Dioscorus was a criminal and evil and also heretical and had to be deposed, as in fact he was. And he was subsequently vilified in all of the ways that ecclesiastical history can vilify a man. In other traditions, of course, the ones that rejected the Council of Chalcedon, such as the Coptic Church in Egypt, Dioscorus was not held to be a villain. And so the question then emerges as to what do the Acts of Chalcedon and the immediately preceding councils actually tell us about Dioscorus? And more importantly, how do we read those acts? Because they're not really impartial, neutral transcripts of what was said and all of the procedures that were implemented. As we now know, many of these acts were shaped and written in a way, and subsequently the dossiers were produced in a way that justified the decisions made at each council. And so just as if you were reading an HR report about a very controversial personnel matter of today, so we have to read these acts with very careful eye to the nuances and the kind of procedural politics that's taking place behind the scenes that produces the outcomes that we see. And this is exactly what my guest has done in a book that is called Patriarch Dioskouros of Alexandria, The Last Pharaoh and Ecclesiastical Politics in the Later Roman Empire. He is Volker Menze of the Central European University, now in Vienna. And he has undertaken exactly such an examination, a kind of forensic inquiry into the background of the councils that Dioscorus was a protagonist at, and the intricacies and imperial dimensions of the councils at which he first, Ephesus 2, 449, was a leader and came out on top, and then 2 years later at Chalcedon, 451, where he was deposed. I have to say, I greatly enjoy this book, though in order to nerd out about these things, you really sort of have to know the church politics and history of this period, and to have studied and read these documents in detail, which I did in part for writing my large history. In fact, you can see them cited in the notes all the time as ACO, which is an abbreviation for this massive multi-volume edition of the Acts that began 100 years ago and is still ongoing. ACO just stands for, it's Latin abbreviation for Acts of the Ecumenical Councils. And Volker and I try to make all of this accessible to you. We understand that not all of you spend your free time reading the Acts of the Ecumenical Councils, but I think it is possible to convey the sense of the politics behind these documents in a conversation such as the one that we recorded. Just to quickly catch you up, we're not going to be talking so much on the theology, but it is important to know that the major theological issue at this time regards the natures of Christ. That is, Christ is understood to be in some ways both human and divine, but how are those two natures, well, any word you use here is taking sides, but sort of conjoined, united, brought into interface, or whatever, in the person of Christ after the incarnation. And there were some theologians who were arguing for a more closer merging of these two natures, and others who saw Christ as kind of embodying them both in certain discrete ways. Anyway, it's complicated. There had been a very messy council at Ephesus in 431, which in a certain sense had not really resolved the issue, though in the aftermath, the Patriarch, the Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, had come out on top, in part through a massive bribe, which we talk about. And then the issue had been reopened a couple of decades later with a trial in Constantinople in 448 of an archimandrite, a monastic abbot named Eutyches, who seemed to be supporting a kind of one-nature solution. The authorities in Constantinople essentially put him on trial and convicted him. I think the Emperor Theodosius did not like this outcome, and so he convened an ecumenical council again at Ephesus in 449 the following year, put Dioscorus in charge. Dioscorus was a reliably one-nature person. The authorities of Constantinople who had condemned Eutyches were then condemned themselves at Ephesus too. Then Theodosius has a freak accident and dies, and his successor, Marcian, convenes another council at Chalcedon the following year, 451, which reverses that outcome. Dioscorus is convicted, and the sort of two-nature proponents come out on top, though Chalcedon is a little bit of a compromise in many ways. Anyway, those are the councils that we are talking about, this kind of back and forth that goes on in the middle of the 5th century. Anyway, you don't need to know too many more details to follow the conversation than that. We get into how a church villain was made, in part, by the way that his behavior and his trial essentially are represented in these acts or what I call HR documents. One brief note before we begin. Volker refers at times to the Tome of Leo I. This is Pope Leo I of Rome. His tome is not what you would imagine as a tome, but is just a document. It's a short text which sets out Leo's own two natures solution to the problem. There is a body of scholarship which sees Leo and Rome as kind of central to this whole process. In my view, Leo and Rome were rather peripheral, but not unimportant. The authorities in the East, Constantinople, Antioch, they always had to take Rome into account, how Rome would react. It was something of a delicate political matter, as you will see from our discussion at times. Okay, I will stop there. Thanks to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Let's get straight to my discussion with Volker. Volker, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So I really enjoyed reading your book. In fact, it was fun for me, but let me qualify that for the audience because I don't know how many in the audience will find it exactly fun in the way that I did. So this is what I would call like forensic bureaucracy, right? It's where you're looking through these very difficult, quasi-bureaucratic records that we have, the acts of the councils and all the associated documents around them, and trying to figure out exactly what happened with these people, and specifically whether this one person was as big a villain as he was later remembered in some traditions. And ultimately, you rehabilitate this, I think, very persuasively, as far as I'm concerned, where you go in detail through the acts of the discussions and the events of these councils and show that what he was doing is not the kind of nefarious, arm-twisting and violent kind of, oppression that he was later accused of, but a very, very different picture emerges of this guy. Anyway, so I find that fun, but also I find those sources fun, and they're perhaps an acquired taste. So why don't we start here? Can you tell us who Dioskouros of Alexandria was and how you got interested in writing this book on him?
Sure, yes, I can do this. He was Bishop of Alexandria, and Alexandria is one of the most important Eastern Mediterranean cities. So as such, he was probably one of the most powerful, or even the most powerful person in late antique Egypt. And maybe as a side note, I call him Patriarch, although the term is slightly anachronistic, like Pope. These are the bishops of Rome at this time. And, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Constantinople, they became patriarchal sees later after the Council of Chalcedon in 451. But at the same time, Dioscorus already, is more powerful than, a normal archbishop at this time. And therefore, I think the term patriarch can be justified. But, this is just as a side note. I speak also of Pope Leo, the opponent of Dioscorus. So for Dioscorus as a person, we don't know anything about his youth. His tenure as patriarch is not very long, something around 7 years. If we think about his predecessor, Cyril, is more than 3 decades, and also, the uncle of Cyril, Theophilus, who was patriarch or bishop before Cyril, was also more than 2 decades. So in this aspect, I think there's nothing particularly remarkable about Dioscorus. And this is probably why we also don't have many studies on him. I know of a longer study from the 1920s, one PhD dissertation from the 1960s. But otherwise, most people who say something about Dioscorus, they have worked on opponents, Leo, Theodoret of Kyros, studies on Chalcedon, etc. And there is where he's remarkable, right? I mean, he is at the same time as some like Theodoret of Kyros is a very important theologian at the time. Leo is also, it's called Leo the Great, also in Western tradition. And we have the Council of Chalcedon, Council of Ephesus, Council of Ephesus too. So he is at a very important time, and he is the one who denies orthodoxy to the Council of Chalcedon, which is regarded the fourth ecumenical council in Western church tradition. And therefore, he became, in the Coptic tradition and other Oriental Orthodox churches, immediately commemorated as a hero, as a confessor. And in the West, he becomes a heretic. So quite frankly, when I started to answer actually your question why I wanted to write about him, it was more a book about the afterlife of Dioscorus. I thought this is actually an area where I can say something. I come from the 6th century. I have worked on the Chalcedonian controversy before. I thought there is something to say new. I didn't realize I could actually say something new about the historical Dioscorus. This was only, I realized this once I actually read the Acts of the Council, particularly Chalcedon, but also Second Council of Ephesus, that I thought there is actually space for revisionist story, and this is something somebody should write about the historical Dioscorus.
Right. So he had presided over the Council of Ephesus II in 449, which, from the standpoint of the later Catholic and Orthodox churches, produced the wrong result. And he was then subsequently condemned 2 years later at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which affirmed the creed that is today used by the Catholic and Orthodox churches. I've used those terms conventionally because, as you've just mentioned, there are other churches which deviated from Chalcedon subsequently, especially the Coptic Church, Syrian Orthodox Church, Armenian churches, and so on. So we get a divergent pictures of Dioscorus. So can you briefly contrast the positive and the negative images of him in these different traditions?
I can do this. Considering actually how many doctrinal controversies we have in late antiquity, it is not surprising that we have ecclesiastical protagonists with divided commemorations. But I have to say, Dioscorus is really one of my favorite in this regard. And I would like to bring in here a quote from the Oriental Orthodox tradition. As you said, I mean, Coptic Church, they have a Synaxarium Alexandrinum in Arabic. And this is, a saints collection of saints for the Alexandrian Church. And this also has been then a tradition in the Ethiopic Church, which only in the 20th century becomes an autocephalous church. Otherwise, it's the Coptic Patriarch. So we have here the tradition, of course, Dioscorus as the hero, as the confessor against the Council of Chalcedon. But it's a tradition where it becomes more palpable as just saying like no to the Western, to Pope Leo and the Diophysite Western understanding of Christ. And so we have him here in front of Emperor Marcian at the Council of Chalcedon, where he not just says no to the tomb of Leo, which is a very important letter that Leo had sent to Constantinople in 449, where he lays down his Christology, Diophysite, two nature of Christ Christology. And this becomes in the East and also, the contentious letter, the evil one, which so he's not just saying no, he's tearing it apart in front of the people. And so, the helpers of the emperor, they come to Emperor Marcian and to actually also the Empress Pulcheria is also there and tell them, all the bishops are fine except Dioscorus is the only one who resists. And so he's brought in front of the emperor. And Saint Dioscorus would not change his orthodox belief. So, I mean, he stands firm in it. And then I quote here, emperor and empress were irritated at this. And the empress commanded them, the soldiers or the people, they're standing, the officials, to smite Saint Dioscorus on his mouth and to pluck out the hair of his beard. And they did so. And then he took the hair of his beard, which they had pulled out, and his teeth, which had dropped out, and sent them to the city of Alexandria. And he said unto the people, behold, this is the fruit of the Orthodox faith. And I think it's a beautiful story, how the saint really suffered and proved his orthodoxy with, his bodily parts, which then, of course, could be venerated in Alexandria. Although I don't know about any, that the relics have actually been venerated in Alexandria. But so this is how in the East he becomes, the confessor. And very much to the contrary, in the Latin West, Dioscorus is a heretic immediately after the Council of Chalcedon, which is interesting insofar as Pope Leo didn't understand any Greek. He didn't have, any translation available. The Acts of Chalcedon are only getting translated in the West almost 100 years later. We have in the 6th century, then several translations, but he nevertheless immediately calls him a heretic. We have this from letters from the 450s where he called him, but technically or legally also speaking, he was not a heretic. He was being stripped of his ecclesiastical position, his priesthood, because he did not appear in front of the Council of Chalcedon after being summoned 3 times, but not really, a heretic. In ecclesiastical terms, nothing can be worse than being regarded as a heretic, and therefore it's also interesting to see the Western tradition, even if we now speak about, non-ecclesiastical tradition, but scholarship, Dioscorus is usually regarded as violent, brutal, scrupulous, and, the less able successor of Cyril, who is venerated actually in most Christian traditions. So there's a lot of continuity in this negative picture in the West, which, I argue against actually in my book.
Yes. So first of all, I love these body horror stories that you find, especially in the Syriac sort of anti-Chalcedonian tradition. There's so much body horror, like in John of Ephesus, where the point is driven home through some pretty gross kind of images. John of Ephesus' account of the plague is incredible in this regard. But also that it is so easy to explain the ecclesiastical history of this period by having a villain. And scholars, I think, have been very tempted by this. Yeah. And I'll confess, like for very many years, and even as I was writing my general history, it's just a very convenient model to have for explaining, how you get within 2 years from one major council to another major council. If you have a villain, you can blame the first one on. I even recall, Voltaire, and in his Voltaire's philosophical dictionary, he has an entry on Flavian of Constantinople, who lost in 449. Yes. And he says that Dioscorus gave Flavian 2 natures, black and blue. I've never
I need
forgotten
to read
that.
this. I didn't know that.
It's so good. Anyway, so you have this kind of image of this violent Patriarch of Alexandria, in a tradition of many other sort of violent patriarchs of Alexandria. It's a seductive kind of image. Okay, correctly, as you say, you dispel a lot of this polemic around him and reveal someone much more kind of ordinary in a way, less great, but also not this villain. 2 things that Dioscorus was struggling with at the beginning of his career was the legacy of Cyril, and specifically the finances of Alexandria. So you talk about this in some detail, that Cyril had used all of these bribes to get the court to do what it wanted, and he had sort of broken, that bankrupted the See of Alexandria. And also the second is that his family, Cyril's family, was sort of entrenched, and Dioscorus takes over, and you argue convincingly that he's a kind of outsider to the Cyrillian faction. What kinds of problems was Dioscorus trying to solve? Like, how did he go about fixing the See of Alexandria after Cyril?
It's a very good question. The common judgment on Dioscorus, as I said, is, he's the less able, more radical successor of Cyril. So in other words, the story goes that Dioscorus had an important and major heritage in hand, both theologically. Cyril is a very important, very productive theologian also. And being in the position as Archbishop of Alexandria, and he failed to handle it properly to some extent. And therefore, before I actually go into Dioscorus and Dioscorus' tenure, I analyzed the prehistory of the Cyrillian heritage, if this is actually correct as such. And I have to confess, I may be to some extent unfair to Cyril if I don't really go into him theologically. As I said, he's a very productive theologian. He has done a lot of this. So I rather look in quotation mark, the dark side of Cyril. I look at the bribery and nepotism. Cyril's bribery is well known, right? It has been discussed by scholars before. We have the sources. It's probably, as far as we know, the largest bribe in antiquity. There might be more, but here we have it in writing. And just before we talked now, I know it's 830 kilograms of gold. I just went online and checked. At the moment, this is more than $60 million. And this is just the gold. There's a lot of gifts, ivory, and maybe also the Bishop of Constantinople was supposed to chip in. By all standards, we have really a sizable, a huge bribe. It's very difficult.
It's a blessing. It's a blessing, right?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yes, of course. Okay, that's another story. Also, the smooth way how to call it a blessing. I wrote another article about this actually, because there's so much to say about this. Yes, there's this was original article, which was I think more than 30,000 words, and then I made an article, and so there. Yeah. Anyway, it's a fun story, and in a sense, it's an extremely successful bribe, right? A lot of bribes, you catch the politicians and they're not successful, but Cyril actually becomes a saint in most traditions, and with the bribe also ensures that this questionable statements he made, which the Eastern bishops did not accept, become actually a cornerstone of orthodoxy. I think that's a very successful actually bribe. So, but
money well spent.
Yeah, money well spent. Okay, so the other one surprisingly, I have to say, the question of Cyril's nepotism has been largely neglected in scholarship. I was a little bit surprised about this. When people regard Dioscorus as Cyril's more radical successor, they never ask if Dioscorus was actually the successor that Cyril wanted, right? They usually assume, but I think, and this is rather probably a new insight of my book, that I argue that Dioscorus became Cyril's successor against the Cyrillian faction and, the Cyrillian family in Alexandria. This is very important for interpreting then the tenure of Dioscorus. I mean, theologically, I think Dioscorus was completely a Cyrillian, but politically, he headed the anti-Cyrillian faction in Alexandria. And probably he had to establish his rule over the church in Alexandria against the Cyrillian family. And he banned Cyrillians and also Cyrillian minions. It's actually funny, we only know this from the Council of Chalcedon in 451, where they are brought forward. And, in order to prove Dioscorus has been a bad patriarch already of Alexandria, and before he's now being accused of heresy, and they come forth. And actually, one of them clearly says he had hope for a better career. And then, Dioscorus kind of kicked him out of the church. I mean, if you read this, I mean, you can really see this, I mean, they were really disappointed with this new patriarch. They had kind of, put a bet on the wrong horse, so to speak. And Dioscorus kicked him out. Of course, these kind of accusations we get then at Chalcedon, we should not take too seriously. I mean, he was a gambler involved with women, a heretic, blaspheming God. I mean, we have this
the usual package. Yeah.
Yes, the usual package. And so, but what is true is he needed to establish himself in Alexandria against this opposition in the early years. And because of the huge bribe, as well as the nepotism, where they also had acquired a lot of the property of the Church of Alexandria, the see was short of cash and most likely in debt. I would assume this is how he started, and of course it's a burden on the tenure at the beginning. I cannot prove this. This with academic data, it's very difficult to say anything with certainty, but I think we do have a difficult financial situation at the time when Dioscorus becomes patriarch. And this is probably also one of the reasons that they brought in and established, he had been archdeacon before, senior official who was able to handle things at the Church of Alexandria against, further Cyrillian minions.
Yeah, after writing the big history, I acquired a much better sense for the value of money. And when they sources mentioned, this much gold, this many coins, and so forth, just to get a sense of how much is that exactly. And that bribe is huge. It's on the large end of things that one could spend. So I believe it entirely that this was a major drain on the church. Let's talk a little bit about the theological side too. So was Dioscorus a great or even prominent theologian in the Cyrillian tradition? Or at any rate, what was his theological position?
Well, I think the short answer is no. He was not likely to be a prominent theologian. There are no theological texts surviving by him, and we also have zero remarks by any supporter or opponent, of any works, mentioning a theological treatise or anything like this. So the only theological statements we have come from letters that have survived when he was in exile. So after the Council of Chalcedon in 451, he had to go to exile in 451 until he died in 454. When he was in exile after the Council of Chalcedon, he died 3 years later. But from this time, actually, we have a few letters. There he presents himself actually as a faithful disciple of Cyril. I think we can say he was a Cyrillian, but there is nothing very remarkable about, what he uses the phrase there, really how Cyril also used them. We have from the Council of Chalcedon also a few statements where he says, I accept from two natures, I do not accept two natures. There are not two natures after the union. I have quotations from the Holy Fathers. He says, Athanasius, Gregory, and Cyril saying in numerous passages that one should not speak of two natures after the union, but of one incarnate nature of the Word, which is, probably not really what Athanasius said, but Apollinarius said, and Cyril took this over. But yes, we can speak about the one nature Christology, I think, and very much a Cyrillian position.
Having said that, you define your book as a political history of the church rather than a theological one. Can you explain the difference between these two approaches?
Yes, I have actually once an argument with a theologian at a conference who criticized my talk on the Council of Chalcedon that I would talk about politics, while councils are about theology. And I think, yes, councils are at least partially about theology and doctrine and, church discipline and etc. But I think if a council is convened by an emperor, it's political by default, right? I mean, if Joe Biden or any kind of president of another country would call for a security or defense summit, or actually also less likely a summit on education, of course, the topic will be security, defense, but it will be political by default, right? And talking about political history is not necessarily better or worse than a theological approach. Both have their justifications, but it's a fact that so far, mainly theologians have worked on the history of councils. I mean, more recently, we get also historians, secular historians, are going to look into this, but that's a much more recent development. I mentioned, for example, in the introduction, Cardinal Grillmeier, who wrote on Chalcedon in the 1950s. He edited a 3-volume set, a huge 3-volume set on the Council of Chalcedon, on its 1500th anniversary, and then later in life wrote another 5 volumes, which I think are all translated also into English. He's a German cardinal, but it's also translated into English. I think Jesus, the Christ in the Christian tradition or in the Christian belief, which is on the Christology, particularly after the Council of Chalcedon. It's a major work, or has been. Some things have been dated, but it still is a major work. I immensely profited from it. I read it already 20 years ago when I worked on my dissertation, and I've also profited, from other theologians. But there is a different approach, and I quote here. Let me quote Grillmeier these sentences which he has. The early history of Christological doctrine now reached its climax at the Council of Chalcedon. It was the purpose of those who were responsible for the synod to put an end to the bitter eternal disputes which had occupied the period after the Council of Ephesus, for Ephesus had left unfulfilled a task which by the stage of development was long overdue, and then creating a dogmatic formula. And I don't know, there might be something really, the Christological doctrine that this is really can be considered a climax. I would not argue with this, but this determinism, right? As a historian, we need to refuse this. There is no history of dogma just developing on its own, reaching a climax. It's people who do this. And one of the things I look into, and I'm also not the first. George Bevan also has written on Nestorius a few years ago, wrote a book. It's not a straight development. There might be detours. History can jump. I mentioned, of course, how we get to Chalcedon. It's Emperor Theodosius dies, and the new Emperor Marcian calls for a council. And Theodosius was a young man, right? He fell off his horse and died. So, it was really by accident this happens, and it's not that, there is a development reaching a climax. So in that sense, I think there is justification for political history to look into this and not just seeing this as a development in the history of dogma.
Yes. I love reading theological scholarship because it takes the ideas seriously in the way in which many of the people at the time took those ideas seriously. And I think that's very, very important. But when they turn the councils into just historical manifestations of those ideas and sort of lose track of the actual political forces that are driving them, you end up with statements precisely like the one that you just read, where the council is interpreted as against a kind of a benchmark of theological perfection. And Ephesus it's not quite, of course, Ephesus was a complete mess in so many ways, right? But theologically, it's like almost there, but you're not quite there, buddy. And then when you have a council that produces the wrong result, like Ephesus 2, then you need a villain. And then finally you have the climax. And this isn't exactly history,
No.
It just doesn't work that way. I like the fact that you your political history is informed by a very close reading of the narrative acts and also the procedure. The procedures here are crucial. As I said, like this is forensic bureaucracy as a bureaucrat now. So I love studying procedure. So you argue that at Ephesus 2, Dioscorus is basically following what he took correctly to be the wishes of Theodosius II. And you see him as trying to do, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but I think you see Dioscorus as someone who understands that the emperor wants his theological position to prevail and is doing the best that he can to run the conference in a credible way to produce that result, according to the emperor's orders. Like, is that right?
Yes. Well, I think one of the side aspects of my book is that we probably need another book on Theodosius II.
Yes.
And his religious policies, that we need this.
Yeah.
There are excellent articles. I mean, Susan Wessel, Thomas Graumann have worked on this, but I think a longer study would probably be in order, kind of a book-length study, because my argument is that Theodosius had considerable control over the council. I don't focus on the emperor, so I mean, I needed at some point, switch. This is Dioscorus, right? This is not on Theodosius. But it is the emperor who controls, I think, the council. I mean, how do you control a council? I think the important part is already the access to the council. We can see this, that the emperor ensured that some of those whom he regarded as heretics, that would be Theodoret of Cyrus, for example, he seems to be really annoyed. I mean, this is, I think, the best way how to describe it. He seems to be continuously annoyed, or even more by Theodoret, not to allow to participate. And others, a total of 42 bishops out of 130, something like this, were requested to remain silent during the discussions. And even more surprisingly, that the emperor also invited then some monks or archimandrites to participate with voting rights in the council, not just bishops, or like bishops like Theodoret had not to come. And Dioscorus and other bishops seem to have been left in the dark about this, who has been actually invited and what's on the agenda, what was supposed to be achieved. And Theodosius was also very clear on what he wanted. We know some of the letters he wrote before the council, so he leaves no doubt whom he regarded as a heretic. Dioscorus, of course, agreed with the anti-Nestorian policy. So there is consensus between Dioscorus, the majority of Cyrillian bishops, about the end product, the eradication of what they called Nestorianism.
I agree with your reading, and it went further than I had gone a few years ago when I was looking into these events, though I'm convinced that one should go that far. But I got the impression that Theodosius II was sort of consistently pro-Cyrillian. After his court had received the bribe, he was very consistent in that position and opposed the trial and condemnation of Eutyches, and was favored bishops and procedures that would maintain a kind of Cyrillian hegemony. And Dioscorus was perfectly happy to go along with that. So I would second what you said. I think we need a close look at Theodosius II's church policy. And after the mess that was Ephesus 1, he made sure that Ephesus 2 was much more tightly run. But again, your book is on Dioscorus. And so you argue that he was a much more careful executor of the imperial will, in the sense of he was also trying to not make more problems for Theodosius II than was necessary, because every council produces losers, and those losers then can create problems. And I love the way you talked about how he handled Leo's Tome. So this is the formulation of doctrine that came from Rome that Dioscorus and presumably Theodosius II also opposed. Can you tell us a little bit about how he handled that and how that was misunderstood in the scholarship?
Sure. I mean, most of what we know about the Council of Ephesus comes then from the Council of Chalcedon. I mean, we have the Acts there, but then also a lot of discussions around this. And one of the major accusations we have there, and we also have a letter by Leo, I think, is the claim that he did not allow Leo's tomb to have been read out at the Council of Chalcedon. And maybe we need to be more specific. Actually, it's not the tomb itself, this kind of Christological letter that was sent in 449 to Flavian of Constantinople. It's the so-called letter 33, which is a short letter, but this refers then to the tomb and would lead them probably also to the reading of the tomb. So we can say, is the tomb being read out at? And the interesting part is if we read the Acts, of 449, they actually don't contain any decision that Dioscorus said, no, we can't read Leo's letter. And there are also no complaints by papal legates that Dioscorus prevented the reading. But it is true that we have the papal legates asking or requesting the letter to be read twice. And the first time you have then Juvenal of Jerusalem, I think, saying something. So, I mean, there could be a procedure like, but twice it's a little bit more than an honest mistake. And, my argument is then, I would assume actually that Dioscorus did not want the letter to be read, that this was not just an honest mistake twice not being read. I think it was on purpose, but it was not really, Leo also in his letter says like, this would have solved the controversy. No, it would not have solved the controversy. It would have been the opposite, because the council in 449 was going against Flavian. It was deposing Flavian. It was, regarding Eutyches as orthodox. So if he would have read Leo's tomb, which, was sent to Flavian, it would have been exactly saying the opposite what the council was actually doing. So it would have been at least embarrassing for the papal legates, who would have been a small minority at the council. There might have been a few others who would have supported them, but otherwise, we're speaking about Cyril. So, it would have been rather that, Leo might have been condemned at this council, or, the papal legates might have been condemned at this council. I think this actually, he did them a favor that this is not being read, but just filed. He files them and says, we put them in here, and, that's about it.
I think that was a very smart reading, actually, because, and I've seen it procedurally, it's not that he was trying to suppress Leo, but to protect the relationships with Rome and not make them worse.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So better to say nothing. This is like, what our parents tell us when we're children. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything. Right? So yes. Rather than be put in a situation where Leo is tied to the people who are being condemned, you just say nothing and hope maybe they'll go away, or, they won't insist on it too much or whatever. But the major problem and accusation, right, against Dioscorus is the violence that he allegedly used at Ephesus too, right? So they're all, then at Chalcedon 2 years later, all of these bishops are saying, but, he beat us up, and there was intimidation, and there were soldiers, and whatever. And I think this is the sort of cornerstone of the case against Dioscorus, is that he was a sort of a violent dictator at the council. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And, as you say, it has always been at the forefront, discussing Ephesus 2 and, what Leo then calls as the robber council, right? Latrocinium is always, it's the question of violence. Was there violence? Was Flavian being killed by Dioscorus? Was he killed by the soldiers, by the monk Basauma? And I let me start actually with, what the bishops say at Chalcedon, give this quote. No one concurred to Dioscorus' sentences. Force was used. Force with blows. We signed blank papers. We were threatened with deposition. We were threatened with exile. Soldiers with clubs and swords stood by, and we took fright at the clubs and sword. We were intimidated into signing. Where there are swords and clubs, what kind of council is it? This is why he had soldiers with him. Drive out the murderer. The soldiers killed Flavian, end quote. So there are several allegations, right, on different levels. If we start with the soldiers, I'm very hesitant to think that Dioscorus as bishop commanded soldiers. I think it would make much more sense to assume that We have soldiers who guarded the church and ensured the smooth sequence of events, prevented external disturbances, which is actually what we read in the, before the council, what the emperor requested. And you mentioned Chalcedon, the first council of Chalcedon, what went wrong, right? We have two councils, they're convening without being, allowed to convene. And then you have two councils. As emperor, you need to decide which one is actually orthodox. No, you run a tight ship. You made sure the bishops only convene when you want them to convene, and there are no disturbances. So the soldiers are there. This is not, but I don't think this is Dioscorus who commands them. And the situation that we have here, I think, is when, the moment after Flavian and Eusebius are being disposed, and several parties disagreed, right? I mean, we have Flavian saying like, no, the papal legates, they disagree. And I would assume that the imperial representatives ordered the soldiers to restore public order and also keep the deposed patriarch under guard. So that would be one. And then if we look at the accusation that bishops were compelled to sign blank papers, I don't think, and they didn't really know that it was about Flavian to be deposed. I don't think this is really a good argument or has any substance. I do think that probably they get papers, but this is to make the sentences at the end subscription, and we have them. There are sometimes individual sentences that can stronger, less strong, how they actually agree. They can write this themselves, the bishops, and they would be handed in. I don't think they were forced to do this. If they would be forced, I'm surprised that how many subscriptions are missing. The papal legates are missing, for example. A few other bishops are missing. No, they are not. I mean, if everybody had signed blank papers in advance, then they could have everybody sign. But we have very individual lists, so I also don't think there is any substance to it. And last but not least, I mean, the intimidation and the threat with exile. Well, I do think any council would threat bishops with exile if they're not agreeing to what the council say, because I mean, supposedly what the council rules is what the church rules. So if you don't agree with the church, you are in exile. So this is actually an argument that fits to any council. So, to answer the question, I don't think the allegations come to anything. I don't think there would be more violence than you find at other council, or more, intimidation. I would, Chalcedon is, I think, very much there's also intimidation. So in a sense, I think Dioscorus is here the scapegoat for the bishops. We always need to have in mind, you have more than 100 bishops, I don't know the exact numbers, have been at Ephesus, and some of them also had to be in 448 in Constantinople, then at Ephesus, and then at Chalcedon, and they agreed with the majority at Constantinople, then they agreed with the majority in Ephesus, and then with the majority at Chalcedon. They needed also to have some kind of reasons why they did this. So force by, the villain, as you said before, is the easiest solution you can have.
Exactly, because these bishops who are complaining have to explain, some of them, why they voted against Eutyches in Constantinople, for him at Ephesus, then against him again at Chalcedon. And so one way to explain that record is to say that, well, I was intimidated and beaten the second time around. And it's also the power of branding. So when Pope Leo calls this the robber council, that term just kind of sticks in the Western tradition, and branding is just so important.
Again, this is like, when we spoke about Cyril before becoming a saint, right? And I mean, his writing, the 12 anathemas, this is an excellent branding. I mean, the robber council, that sticks, yes?
Yeah, it's like why we still call some people Arians, who, in their mind are Orthodox Christians. But anyway. So why did imperial policy change so dramatically after the death of Theodosius II?
A very good question, but it's not an easy question to answer. I think there are two main reasons. Maybe one is very simple. We have a Theodosian dynasty that ruled the Eastern Roman Empire for more than 80 years, but because Theodosius II didn't have an heir, it should have been the Western Emperor, Valentinian III, actually, who selects a successor for the eastern half of the emperor. But instead, we have Pulcheria, the sister of Theodosius, marrying Marcion. So he becomes new emperor. He needed the support of the West in order to be regarded not a usurper, but as the legitimate emperor in the East. In order to get Western support is through the papacy. I mean, we can see how the papacy has influence also on the Western court, writing letters after the Second Council of Ephesus. Also, I mean, the emperor, but also the royal family writing letters. So, an agreement with the papacy would very likely get Marcian what he needed, the legitimacy from the West. So that's one of the reasons. The other one, I think, is Theodosius' authoritarian ecclesiastical politics, which worried, I think, also those Cyrillian bishops who actually, went along. I mean, who were, victorious at the Second Council of Ephesus in 449. Imperial interferences, I mean, it's something in ecclesiastical affairs, of course, that is standard, right? I mean, we know this since Constantine. I mean, emperors do this, but I think maybe Theodosius II went beyond what was acceptable. He ignored established ecclesiastical procedures. He removed bishops arbitrarily. He censored, 1/3 of the bishops to attend an ecumenical council or, actually to speak there. He replaced bishops with archimandrites. And after the Second Council of Ephesus, he prescribed orthodoxy by law. This is also something, I mean, which we see here very prominently. In short, it's very high-handed action against bishops, anti-episcopal measures, and it's threatening the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And so this is why I think we see after 449 hesitancy really to defend the Council of Ephesus in 449, because there came many different things came together here, so that people thought it might be good to do something else.
This is where the political reading pays off, because you have to explain why emperors convened these two major councils in such close succession. This isn't because the spirit was playing out doctrine in some sort of abstract way. This is because there were very specific interests at the court at a very weird moment. I am always struck by the fact that the succession after Theodosius II was decided by an Arian barbarian general, a pagan Isaurian general, and the emperor's sister.
Yes.
Which is such an odd group. Anyway, and they divided it all up and decided who would be emperor and how it would all go down. I want to mention you have some very close readings of the events of those years, and so specifically, and we don't have time to get into them now, which is how the Council of Chalcedon was originally supposed to be at Nicaea and was later moved to Chalcedon. And then the part of the book I actually love the most is how Dioscorus found himself to be the accused party at Chalcedon, something that he probably didn't expect would happen. But there's this wonderful turn of events, and suddenly he finds himself on trial, which is not what he expected would happen. Anyway, I think the book, that's the payoff of the book. I mean, your argument kind of builds up to it, but I don't think we have time to get into it now. Can you tell us at the end why you called Dioscorus the last Pharaoh?
Sure. At the beginning, I said how Dioscorus was bishop, not really yet a patriarch, but that he had the power of a patriarch, and might have been the most powerful person in Egypt, more powerful than probably even the governor of Egypt at this time. Well, this is not a modern insight, but this is already what contemporaries saw. And many bishops outside Egypt were not amused that these patriarchs of Alexandria made politics outside the diocese, outside Egypt, meddled with church ecclesiastical politics in the Near Eastern provinces and also in Constantinople. So because these bishops or patriarchs of Alexandria, they were in Egypt, they were powerful, and they are kind of your opponents, right? I mean, they regarded the meddling as evil. What better way than to call them pharaohs, to give them the biblical term of pharaohs? And Dioscorus is not the first to be named the pharaoh. I think it was actually Theophilus. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Theophilus, Cyril's uncle, predecessor of Cyril, 385 to 412, I think, as Archbishop of Alexandria, who was first insulted as Pharaoh, or I think it's in Zosimon or Socrates. And then Leo also uses this in a letter against Dioscorus. He speaks of a second pharaoh, also the biblical one, and now it's Dioscorus. And I use it, I mean, the last pharaoh, this is then, my phrase I use last, because we have this most powerful churchman in the Eastern Mediterranean until Chalcedon. After Chalcedon, the balance of power, geopolitics changed in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Alexandria lost its most influential position and was replaced by Constantinople. We can clearly see this in the 6th century. Constantinople was very late as a bishop see and also as patriarch. But because of the political importance as capital, we can see in the 6th century, I mean, it has basically replaced Alexandria.
So tell us about the cover of the book. This is great. This is great art. First, can you just briefly describe what it is, and then tell us where this comes from?
It's an icon of Dioscorus, but with some ancient Egyptian art, right? Holding not a cross, but I mean, this is what the pharaoh usually is holding in his hands. It's a little ironic, of course, to have him both as an icon, so as a saint, but at the same time depicting as pharaoh. The background is Alexandria and the Council of Chalcedon, where he is also standing there. This is, a traditional art. And my father made this. So I had asked my father if he would design the cover for me, and he did this, and I'm very happy with this. The publisher was also using. I'm very happy with the cover. I think a good cover is also important for a book, and so I'm very happy to have this.
Does he make other icons?
No, he is a retired physicist, but he loves, to make prints and, people. I have a very nice picture actually also of Peter Brown he made a long time ago.
Right.
Peter Brown also has this. He likes this. So yeah.
Yes, and I like the colors. They remind me of like some of the interior decorations of Coptic churches.
Yes.
Oh
yes,
yeah. These the red and the yellow and yeah. Absolutely, they're very, very colorful.
Thank you. Yes.
Anyway, and again, I really enjoyed this book, and also the opportunity to talk with you about it, because sometimes it's nice to geek out about these very esoteric matters. We've mentioned probably a dozen people. The audience don't know who we're talking about, and
we can find more esoteric. We could make a list. I mean,
you end up with these paragraphs where when you're speaking or you're giving a talk or you're having to explain these events, and in the paragraph are mentioned Cyril, Flavian, Eutyches, Dioscorus, Theodoret, Theodosius II, and Marcion. For anything to make sense, you need all of those people.
Yes, yeah.
They're not household names.
No, I know. Yeah.
But they're so fascinating to track. You know what? They are the people we know the most, like from ancient history, because of these records. It's just incredible.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So Volker, thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to your next book project, whatever that may be. When it's out, we can talk about that.
Thank you. I would love to be here on again. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Thanks, Anthony.
Mine too.